All right, and thanks for inviting me here. I'm going to make a presentation, a case study from the National Museum of Denmark, looking at two exhibitions and actually the flow between these two exhibitions. The first of them is the one that you can see here, called Girl with Parasol, Japan in the Photo Studio, which we curated in 2013. And this exhibition featured some 80 black and white hand-colored photographs from the 1880s and 1890s from Japan. Actually, it's not part of the National Museum of Denmark collection. It is from Museo delle Culture in Lugano, so it was alone. But we actually also do have quite a lot of these photographs ourselves in our collection. And talking about models, Nicholas Thomas, he mentioned before, in a way you can also see these as models, at least as very compressed images of culture. And I mean, they are visually stunning and the artwork is brilliant, but also the representation of Japan in these, as you see here, for example, through the tattooed messenger and the geisha, are slightly stereotypical, or at least highly ortho-ethnographic. And we wanted to engage these notions of ortho-ethnography, stereotypical presentations of Japan, and engaging our visitors in these kinds of images. You can see a few more here. And for that, we had another part of the exhibition which jumped quite far up in time until photo studio representations of Japan today through this photo booth called Purikura, which is mainly used by young women and their boyfriends at times, and also in various ways plays with notions of beauty, and you have the same kinds of chances to manipulate with the photo afterwards in the editing session of the photo booth. And having this part of the exhibition was also a way of, in the end, displaying the visitors on the wall, as you can see on the right side. So we sort of intended to have visitors to come and have a look at these notions of Japaneseness, mainly through the hand-painted photographs, but also engaging themselves in various ways in this sort of imaginary landscape of Japan. This is just one example of what Purikura in Japan look like. In terms of co-collecting, well, I did interview a group of Japanese users, former users and current users of this Purikura, who through video interviews talked about how they used the photo booth, how they played with the colors, the images, notions of beauty and so forth. Interestingly, the exhibition was quite well received by visitors. We obviously had a lot of young visitors who never came to the museum before. Some of them said, we loved the exhibition. When I talked to them about what they loved, they said, well, there was something Japanese coming on the way to the photo booth. So of course, for some of them, the photo booth in itself was the exhibition. But anyway, there were voices from the Japanese, a group of Japanese users of this photo booth. One of the criticisms of the exhibition was that we did not engage critically enough with the notions of beauty, of relations between men and women, and so forth in using this photo booth. And that's quite an interesting discussion, because I, on purpose, did not write anything about what I thought about this sort of aesthetics and so forth, but the voices came through the so-called actual users of the photo booth. But according to some critics, this was, interesting enough, not enough. The museum should actually have been much more engaged in relating critically with this sorts of this kind of very commercialized kind of modernity. And as I said, we wanted the visitors to engage in various kinds of playful ways in these sorts of stereotypical notions of Japaneseness. And in a way, this quite directly led to the next exhibition, in which the hand-painted photographs from Lugano went back to where they came from, to Lugano, but we kept the Purikura. So we had this sort of interesting challenge that, because there were quite a lot of young visitors, there was an interest in the museum of finding a way to prolong the thematic and find a way to integrate it into our permanent collections, only without, of course, these hand-colored black and white photographs from the 1880s and 1890s of Japan. And one of the things I picked upon was that we had quite many visitors who came to the museum in cosplay costume, which is of course a very obvious kind of referencing Japanese image-scapes. Not so much the 1880s and 1890s image-scapes, but manga, anime, and video games, but also, quite interestingly, a smaller group of youth who are very much interested in Korean aesthetics, Hallyu, the Korean popular culture through TV dramas, through the pop music especially, who also came with various kinds of referencing in using this photo booth. And that led to a project where I, in the beginning, interviewed these two distinct groups of Danish youth engaged in Japanese and South Korean popular culture, and it turned into an exhibition focusing not on the latter group, the South Korean popular culture, but only the Japanese part. So a year later, this year, in March, we opened an exhibition focusing on what you can say this sort of transnational aspect of Japanese visual culture, media culture, and popular cultures through the perspective of, respectively, 3 Danish and 3 Japanese cosplayers. So that's, of course, sounds like a very neat way of saying here you have Danish youth engaging in cosplay and Japanese, but we did our best to sort of not make that sort of a comparison too obvious, but on the contrary, to find ways to ingrain or integrate these narratives. And also, these 3 Japanese and Danish cosplayers are, I mean, there is no sense of representativeness being presented through their voices. This is 6 young people who are telling their story about how they are inspired by manga, anime, and video games, and so forth, and how they turn this sort of fandom into various kinds of creative products. The most obvious of these creative products is, of course, the cosplay photography, where you have various kinds of engagements with, in this case, in Japan, very popular ninja school series, but also, and I didn't bring this photo, some photos which in a European context is slightly more controversial. Hotaru, this Japanese cosplayer, is very much engaged in a series called Hetalia, which is male, cute, or very masculine figures who are representing nations. So you have, for example, Germany, Russia, mainly focusing on the Second World War, and so you have quite a lot of Japanese cosplayers engaging these, I mean, at a first sight, extremely politicized kinds of images of German soldiers in various kinds of scenes that are playing with sexuality in kind of upsetting and disturbing ways. So we were trying to find ways also to integrate these sorts of narratives in the exhibition. But more than anything, and as for the notion of community, we also tried to make the exhibition space into a kind of workshop place. So we had 2 rooms in the permanent collections, and the room that you can see a part of here is the room which is sort of the workshop, recreating the place where the cosplayers will be making their costumes, reading manga, playing video games, and so forth. And we are having a continual weekend workshops where, unfortunately, not the Japanese cosplayers. That would be, I mean, talking about the economics, we have only been able to invite the Japanese cosplayers on 2 occasions to meet the Danish cosplay community and meet the general audience, but the 3 Danish cosplayers are very much engaged in this exhibition, and in fact they are calling this their exhibition. It's not them being presented in the museum. They see this very much as their space, which is quite fine with me. I mean, maybe that some of the ideas about what this space should be used for is different from what the museum is thinking about, but they consider this as their space. This was just one case study from the National Museum, where we were trying to engage this notion of transnationalism in a slightly different way from some of the other things we are doing. In 2 years, there will be an exhibition featuring post-colonial relations between Denmark and some of our former colonies. So this is, of course, as a case study, not something that stands alone and represents in any way whatsoever the way that the National Museum of Denmark is engaging transnational issues. On the contrary, I think it's a quite nice parallel to, as I said, for example, the upcoming exhibition, which will, in a much more politically critical way engage notion of transnationalism and Danish colonial history. And I think just to mention a third project, which some of you might have heard about before, and which is, I guess, one of the most interesting things going on in the museum, is a collaboration between Greenlandic graphic artist Noga and the group of Danish researchers, mainly archaeologists, working on the history of Greenland. And they have now for 4, 5, I'm not quite sure, quite a few years been working together on translating the archaeologists' history of Greenland into a graphic novel, which is also traveling it has been published in Japan and going to different places. But the main point here is, of course, this sort of interaction between a graphic artist and this group of researchers. But with that, thank you.